It may be just how frequently magic appears in fantasy, but magic seems to be one of the much tamer aspects of Anima, even though there's 3 different facets to this particular ability, and all sorts of stupidly overpowered things you can do with it. The 3 facets of magic in Anima are spellcasting, summoning, and invocations. There's 2 characteristics you'll need to emphasize if you want your character to use magic. The most important one is power, since this determines your base magic accumulation, which is necessary regardless of what magic or branch you'll be using. Power is also used to determine your base Xeon, which you can think of as mana from most computer RPGs. Xeon is basically the fuel needed for most magical abilities. Magic accumulation is how much Xeon you can gather in a given turn. You can spend development points to raise your accumulation multiple, which is multiplied by your base accumulation to get the final rating. So if you have a base magic accumulation of 10, every magic accumulation multiple gives you 10 Xeon you can gather per turn, and every character starts off with one such multiple. Magic accumulation is also a rating of how much Xeon you regain every day, so be careful with how often you sling spells around if you have a low accumulation, since it'll take quite some time to regain all that Xeon. If your character does anything besides gathering Xeon during a turn though, their magic accumulation is halved, though you can spend multiple turns gathering Xeon if you need more. Intelligence is the next most important, especially if you're focusing on spellcasting. It's less important for summoning an invocation. I'll get into the specifics of why that is later as I discuss them all individually. First, we'll start off with spellcasting. In order to cast spells, your character needs the advantage called the gift. Spells are specific effects a character can cause using magic. In addition to magic accumulation, you'll also need an ability called magic projection to aim your spells. Magic projection is bought using development points, and it's affected by dexterity. For spells that can be easily voided or used to stop an attack, it's much like attacker defense. If a spell doesn't require some sort of defense roll to avoid though, magic projection determines how far out you can reach with that spell. With that in mind, the next reasonable question is how can a character learn spells? This is where intelligence comes in. A character's intelligence rating determines how many levels and magical paths a character gets. There's a chart on page 112 that determines how many levels you gain for putting into spell paths, and it's based on the character's intelligence. The kicker is this though, every one of these paths has an opposite. Having just one level in one path doubles how many levels you need to spend to learn its opposite. The opposites are as follows: light opposes dark, fire opposes water, air opposes earth, essence opposes illusion, creation opposes destruction, and necromancy opposes everything else. This has the exact implications you think it does. Once you learn something that isn't necromancy, you have a harder time learning necromancy, with the opposite being true as well. You'll have a harder time learning anything that isn't necromancy once you learn necromancy. There's 2 methods for assigning spell levels, each with their own benefits and drawbacks. The first is simply to assign your spell levels to certain paths and gain spells in sequential order. This method gives you more spells, but you don't have as much say over what spells it is you get. As an example, let's assume your character has an intelligence of 6, granting you 10 spell levels, and you'll be putting them into Path of Air. This gives us 5 spells, since we'll know every air spell up to level 10. This gives us Raise Wind, Move, and Weight Reduction, as well as 2 spells titled Free Access. Anywhere when using the first method where you would get such a spell, you can choose one of the spells from the Free Access section, starting on page 163. Free access spells are generic, weaker versions of other spells from other paths. Depending on what path it was that granted you a free access spell, there may be some spells you're forbidden from taking. The second method for choosing spells is that you can get specific spells out of order, though depending on the level of the spell, it'll cost a different amount of levels. The benefit here is that you have a great deal of control over your spells, but on the whole, you'll know a lot less. As you can see from this chart, spells that are level 10 or lower still only take 2 levels to gain, but for every 10 levels higher the spell is, you need to shell out an additional 2 levels. So, now that we know the 2 ways to choose our character spells, let's take a look at a spell description block and break down what everything means. Here we have the spell Create Darkness. Level and cost should be fairly obvious. It's the spell's level and how much Xeon you need to spend to cast it. Description also shouldn't take too much to figure out. It's an explanation of what the spell does. And here, Create Darkness turns an area with a 15-foot radius pitch black. Added effect is something to make note of if you decide the spell needs to be stronger. It's what happens for every 10 extra Xeon you spend when casting the spell. Meaning if we spend 30 Xeon while casting it, we'll cover a 30-foot radius instead. Maximum Xeon is a formula for determining how much Xeon you're able to spend on this spell. If we have an intelligence of 6, the most we could spend is 120 Xeon. Maintenance is how much Xeon you need to spend to keep the spell active. This is usually a fraction of how much was originally spent. The amount in parentheses is the maintenance cost for the base cost. So here, since Create Darkness normally costs 20 Xeon, it costs 2 Xeon to upkeep. If we cast it as a 40 Xeon spell though, we would need to spend 4 Xeon to keep it up. Another thing to note about the maintenance part of the description is the word daily. This isn't present on every spell, but for those where it is, this means you would pay the maintenance cost, well, once per day. For daily maintenance spells, this comes out of the Xeon you would regain on a given day. If a maintenance cost doesn't have the word daily, that means you would have to pay it every combat turn, which is just a few seconds. The cost for these comes straight out of your character's Xeon pool. The final aspect is the type of spell that it is. Attack and defense spells allow you to use your magic projection to attack and defend. Spiritual spells still require an attack roll using the caster's magic projection to affect an enemy. However, unless the target can see magic or supernatural forces somehow, they're considered blind for the purposes of defense. Furthermore, if they don't have some method of affecting incorporeal creatures or energy, they're unable to use their block ability as well. The final line of defense against these kind of spells, if all these happen to apply to your character, is having armor, and even then, it has to be armor that's capable of blocking energy attacks, which is kind of rare. Effect, automatic, and detection spells don't require a roll using magic projection. Instead, if they're able to be resisted, it's usually done so using a character's magic resistance ability. The last thing to note about spellcasting is the magic appraisal secondary ability. This is basically a skill that allows somebody to know if magic is being used in an area, if somebody is capable of wielding magic, or even to hide those facts. Next is summoning. Summoning is a magical ability that doesn't require the advantage, the gift. Much like spellcasting, summoning requires a high power, since it relies heavily on Xeon. Intelligence and willpower are also important to summoners. Intelligence is used to give a boost to your occult skill. That way your character will know what it is they're summoning and thus avoid penalties for summoning something unfamiliar. And willpower is used to improve your character's chances of controlling the creatures they summon. Summoning is divided into 4 abilities, each which need to be raised individually. Summon, Control, Bind, and Banish. The difficulty level you need to beat in order to be successful with a given ability is based on the level of the creature you're using it on, and this chart is listed on page 176. This chart also includes the Xeon cost you would need to pay when you're making that roll. There's one part of the summoning rules that I couldn't find a clear explanation for in the core rulebook, and that's whether or not magic accumulation is used for determining how quickly you can generate the Xeon cost for summoning abilities. Regardless of whether it is or isn't though, magic accumulation is still very useful for summoners, since it's also a measure of how quickly you can recover your Xeon. Summon, Control, and Banish are all pretty self-explanatory. Summon brings a spiritual or magical creature into the physical world. They're still free to do what they want until the summoner tries to use Control, and Banish will forcibly return them back to their world. A creature that's being controlled by a summoner, if they decide they don't like being beholden to the summoner, may attempt every hour to free itself from the summoner's control, or every time the summoner gives an order that contradicts its nature. Bind requires a little bit of an explanation though. When you use Bind on a summoned creature, you're sealing it away in a physical object, or a living creature's body. A creature that was bound stops existing. You can't banish it, or control it, or use any other summoning powers on it. The only interaction the bound creature can have with the world is by spiritually communicating with whoever possesses the object it's bound to, or the creature that it's bound to. The stronger the creature you're binding, that is, the higher presence it has, the stronger of a vessel you need to bind it to. Most objects have a presence of about 30 or so, but higher quality objects have a much higher presence, along with other bonuses as well. Basically, a creature can only be bound to an object if the object has as much presence as the creature. A living being, however, can harbor something up to twice its own presence. Additionally, if the vessel has a much higher presence than the creature bound to it, you can store more creatures in it. For example, a high-quality crystal ball with a presence of 80 can store a creature with 30 presence and another that has 50. The final thing to note about binding creatures is that every day your character has to pay the original cost required to bind that creature. This amount is paid in the same way as the cost for a daily maintenance spell is. It comes out of your daily Zeonic regeneration. Binding is also used to gain familiars. This is a process that spiritually binds the summoned creature and its summoner. The benefits of having a familiar are that the summoner can see everything the familiar sees, and also cast spells through the familiar, or share their Xeon regeneration with the familiar. Though it takes a pretty significant investment to bind the familiar. It costs 10 times more Xeon than normal, and the roll is much more difficult. Furthermore, if a familiar is wounded, the summoner has the possibility of being knocked unconscious. If the familiar somehow dies, then the summoner also permanently loses 1 point of power. Summoning ability rolls are affected by the time spent preparing them. You can summon, control, bind, or banish immediately, or you can take a few turns, hours, days, or even years. The chart on page 178 shows the associated bonus or penalty for how much time is spent on a summoning ability. The baseline, where you would have no penalties or bonuses, is 5 turns. The final thing to note about summoning abilities is this. It can grant a character access to some supremely powerful allies, but at the same time, the price for failure is very steep. The chart on page 180 describes in more detail what happens when a summoner fails, as well as what the consequences are for different magnitudes of failure. I'll sum them up here. Failing by a small margin just makes nothing happen. However, higher margins always drain Xeon out of a character, and at higher still margins, such as by 50 points or so, you start having the opposite effect of what you were trying to accomplish. So with that in mind, rushing a summon ability is a fantastic way to make terrible things happen. The final magical ability I'm going to be talking about is Invocations. Invocations, in my opinion, are the coolest of the magical abilities. The most concise way to describe them is that they're similar to the summoning magic from Final Fantasy. You spend a tremendous amount of magical power, in this case Xeon, and you get a gigantic payoff for it. They're also the coolest things thematically, since a character can't learn invocations the same way they learn spells or about creatures to summon. In order to use an invocation, they have to first prove themselves worthy by completing some sort of quest. Invocations are based on the same summon ability used for, well, summoning. It's also subject to the same time modifiers. The first thing they do is they roll their summon for the invocation. That creature that they summoned, the invocation, gives them a quest that they need to fulfill. Upon fulfilling said quest, they summon the invocation again, and then they later have access to that creature's power every subsequent time they summon. However, if they summon the creature before the quest is complete, they fail the quest and can never again summon that invocation. However, once the character gains the power of the invocation, they gain access to some very powerful effects that are also very similar to spells. The effects range from magical attacks and defenses to other unique effects. Any of them that require aiming or rolling for an ability typically use their own ability instead of the invoker's. So for the Magician invocation, which allows the invoker to cast any free access spell that's up to level 50, it would use a magic projection of 120, instead of the invoker's magic projection, which is very likely to be much lower. And now for some final thoughts on magic abilities. First, it can be really satisfying to lob giant fireballs or energy blasts at enemies, but never overlook your other spells. Create Darkness used in conjunction with See in Darkness can feasibly do a lot more damage than a well-placed Dark Beam. Second, magic accumulation is very important. Without magic accumulation, you can't quickly cast spells, and you'll also very quickly run out of Xeon points for, well, just about everything. While this isn't as damning for classes that specialize in both magic and some other ability, wizards can very quickly wind up cursing themselves that they waste all their Xeon and have no sort of backup plan. Third, innate magic. If you have a really high magic accumulation, you can cast spells without having to use your own Xeon. It may take a great deal of magic accumulation to be able to cast things like healing innately, but you could much more easily cast Communicate through Essence with innate magic, effortlessly solving the problem of how you keep in touch with your allies. Finally, summoning takes a lot of work to use effectively, and it's also a pretty great burden on the GM. The core rulebook doesn't have a great deal of stat blocks for summoned creatures, so it may require the GM to write up a lot of their own stats for creatures. However, since summoning powers can be used on any otherworldly creature regardless of how it originally got into the world, this opens up plenty of opportunities for interesting all-summoner parties. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, you can give me one of those likes that I enjoy oh so very much. Bear in mind, this video isn't a substitute for actually reading the core rulebook. But if you're already familiar with the rules, such as by watching this video, it should be much easier to go through it when you're reading it again. So, with all that said, I am Aaron Dershadel, and I will see you all next time.